This message is a presentation of Pinnacle Baptist Church and the preaching ministry of Pastor Ray McBerry. Other messages like this are available online at pinnaclebaptist.com. The church is located at 2517 High Falls Road in Griffin, Georgia. If you're in the area, we would love for you to visit us this Sunday. Now, here's today's message.
Well, we just finished going verse by verse through the book of Amos. We went through Joel and then Amos, and now that brings us to the little bitty book of Obadiah. Obadiah is the shortest book in the Old Testament. It's only 21 verses long, so it's only one chapter. And it is, of course, like we've talked about before, it's one of these books called the Minor Prophets. Again, they're not minor prophets because their message is unimportant, less important than the other prophets, but they're called the minor prophets because their books are generally shorter than the books of the major prophets. And the book of Obadiah is also unique in that it deals with a particular neighbor of Israel and of Judah that, well, it got its own book of the Bible. So this book of the Bible is a message that is to and about one of Israel's neighbors. I kind of think that it was actually intended for the people of Judah to hear the message, but it's about their neighbor down here in Edom, the Edomites. They're the only group of people that are not Israel or Judah or the church. They got their own book of the Bible, but Edom has their own book of the Bible. It's a message of prophecy about Edom. It's a message of judgment and a message of prophecy together. As we go through tonight, we're going to see the prophecies that God gives regarding the land of Edom and the people of Edom. We'll also see, though, as we go through here, some of the things for which God is judging the people of Edom. And as we've said with the other neighbors around Israel and Judah, there are unfortunately, some striking similarities between what God judges them for and what He judged Israel and Judah for, but also what we stand in judgment of as a country today here in America. So we'll see some parallels there, perhaps even with our own country today. I want to direct your attention to the map before we get started. I've got two different maps that we're going to look at tonight as we go through. Here is the northern kingdom of Israel. Here's the southern kingdom of Judah. And here's Edom. Now, I'm going to take this map down in just a moment because there's another map that I'm going to use for the majority of our time together tonight. But I want us to also do some things regarding the history of Edom before we actually get to verse 1 even. This is a little bit of background, a little bit of introduction. I'll give you the general information that we normally do when we start a book of the Bible. The writer of the book, that is the human author who penned the words under inspiration of the Holy Spirit, of course, is the prophet Obadiah. There are 12 other individuals in the Old Testament that are mentioned in different places here and there named Obadiah. But to the best of our understanding, this Obadiah is not any of those 12. So it would appear there are 13 Obadiahs in the Old Testament, but this one is the one who is the prophet. It doesn't seem like any of the other Obadiahs mentioned are this particular Obadiah. It's not an unusual name or wasn't an unusual name among the people of Israel in that day and time. So to us, that sounds like a very unusual name, but in that day and time, it would not have been. Now, Obadiah is the writer. He's writing, obviously, about Edom. The prophecy and the judgment is about Edom. We believe that because of some of the things contained in the book of Obadiah, it seems that he is writing from the kingdom of Judah, so probably his intended audience for reading this book would have been the southern kingdom of Judah and the people who lived here as well. But of course, the message is for anyone who reads the book. We don't really know the date for the book of Obadiah. Some of the books of the Old Testament give us events that occur in relation to the time period in which they were written, so we can kind of narrow down some approximate time periods when many of the books of the Old Testament were written. Unfortunately, the book of Obadiah is not one of those books where we can definitively say this is when it was written. But there are some things that might give us some clues. We'll look at those as we go through this short book in just a little while. But I thought what we would do is we would start out this evening. I want to do just a little bit of background history on who is Edom, who are these people, from where do they come, and who are their relatives. So what I want to do, I want to start up here with Abraham. Now, Abraham had one son of promise through his wife Sarah. Who is Abraham's son of promise through Sarah? Isaac. That in Isaac shall thy seed be called. So here's his son Isaac. And his mother's name was Sarah. Put that in parentheses there. But as you remember from the story of Abraham and Sarah, God had told Abraham that he was going to make of him a great nation, but he was already an old man at that point. It did not seem to him or Sarah very likely that they were going to produce any children. And so Sarah made a big mistake. It was a big mistake then. It's continued to be a big mistake ever since then. But she gave Abraham her handmaiden and told him to go into her and raise up a son in Sarah's name through her handmaiden. What was the name of her handmaiden? Here's your trivia question for the night. Starts with an H. She was an Egyptian, T.R. Hagar, that's right. Very good. All right, so let's do this. Hagar, I'll put her name in parentheses like we did Sarah. She was an Egyptian, as Brother Mike said. She had a son with Abraham before Isaac was ever born. What was this son's name? Ishmael, that's right. And this is not Ishmael from the Moby Dick story. This is the Ishmael from the Bible. Now, before we continue, we'll tell the rest of the story, as Paul Harvey would say. Abraham had another wife after Sarah died in his old age, and she too bore him children. Does anybody remember that little-known wife of Abraham that he married and raised up children with after Sarah died?
It starts with a K.
It does start with a K. Miss Mary, you get the gold star tonight.
I can't remember her name, but it started.
All right. Well, hey, the fact that you remembered it started with a K, that's great. All right. Keturah, that's right. Her name is Keturah. And I'll put her name in parentheses like we did Sarah and Hagar. He has a number of children with Hagar, and I want to see who those children are in just a moment. But first of all, let's look at one passage in the Old Testament that has to do with Ishmael. So hold your place here at Obadiah, and let's turn back, if we could, to Genesis chapter number 16. And let's see what God had to say about Ishmael, the child that Abraham had with Hagar, the Egyptian handmaiden. If the preacher can turn there. All right. In Genesis 16, look with me at verses 11 and 12. It says, "And the angel of the Lord said unto her," that is unto Hagar, "Behold, thou art with child, and shalt bear a son, and shalt call his name Ishmael, because the Lord hath heard thy affliction." That's what his name means. "And he will be a wild man. His hand will be against every man, and every man's hand against him. and he shall dwell in the presence of all his brethren. So we have what God says as a prophecy against Ishmael. It says he's going to be a wild man. He'll be against every man. Every man that meets him will be against him. Well, let's see a little bit of who Ishmael's descendants are. So at this point, turn over with me, if you would, still in the book of Genesis, to chapter number 28. Genesis 28. Yes, ma'am. All right, actually, I got ahead of myself. So just hold your place there. And we'll come back to these verses. So we've got Ishmael. God has said of him that he would be a wild man, and every man's hand would be against him. He would be against every man. On the map that I'm going to use as our secondary map here, the descendants of Ishmael end up settling south of where Abraham was at the time. This area where my hand is right here, parallel to the Dead Sea, between the Dead Sea and the Mediterranean, this is where Abraham spent most of his time. It's the area that today we, looking back on it, refer to as the kingdom of Judah or the land of Judah. The descendants of Esau were nomadic people that lived south, kind of between the land of Israel and the Sinai Peninsula. They roamed nomadically in this area here, the wilderness of Sin. And so, wilderness of Zin. This area was the area that they lived for hundreds and hundreds of years. They were nomads, they had flocks and so forth, but they also traded with people that came through there. They would trade with people, then they would take the wares and trade them elsewhere, back and forth between Egypt and between the Levant, which is the land of Israel and Canaan. So those are the descendants of Ishmael. Today, those descendants of Ishmael would make up some of those people that we know as the Arab people, the Palestinian people. They're kind of mixed in with some of the other people that we're about to see to make up the Arabs of today. Now, we know who the descendants of Isaac are, but let's recreate that for ourselves as well. Let me put something here to hold my place in Obadiah. Underneath Isaac, Isaac had two sons as well. They were actually twins. Who were those two boys? Jacob and Esau, that's right. All right, so who was the firstborn of the two?
Jacob.
No, it was Esau, that's right. Well, if it wasn't Jacob, it had to be Esau. So there we go. There's Esau, and here's Jacob.
Jacob grabbed his heel.
Jacob grabbed his heel as they were, that's right, as Esau was being born first. Jacob, a baby, an infant, reached up, grabbed his heel, and his name actually means heel grabber or supplanter. And of course, we know the story later on of Jacob and Esau. Jacob does supplant Esau as the firstborn because Jacob ends up receiving not only the birthright as the eldest son, but the blessing as the elder son as well. He sells Esau a bowl of pottage in exchange for the birthright, which means a double portion of the inheritance, and being the next patriarch of the family. The blessing that would come, that would be in addition to the birthright, why he tricked Esau out of getting that when their father was lying there dying and his eyes were dim in his old age, and he called for Esau to lay his hands on him and bless him as the elder son. And of course, their mama, Isaac's wife, Rebekah, she's the one who helped Jacob deceive his father into thinking he was Esau. But Jacob got both the blessing and the birthright. He, of course, is the one who is going to be the chosen one of God to be the father of this line of promise that began with Abraham. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God changes Jacob's name to what? To Israel. And so I'll put that out beside there. Esau then is kind of left out in the cold. He's not happy about that. Jacob is gone for over 14 years. It's longer than that. And when he finally returns home, and Esau comes out to meet him with an army of his servants. Jacob thinks that Esau and this 200 men that are with him are about to kill him and all of his wives and children and take all of his stuff. But of course, that's not what happens. Esau rides out, meets him, falls on his neck, hugs his neck, weeping, and kisses him on the cheek, and they're reconciled together. And then they agree to part ways. Now, I'm going to hold off on this for just a second. Let's go on to Keturah. Abraham's third wife was Keturah. We won't look up any of the verses, but Keturah had several sons with Abraham also. He was a very old man, but he's still having children. One of them is of interest to us. That is the son named Midian, because the Midianites end up settling in the north end of not the Sinai Peninsula, the Arabian Peninsula. All of this area right in here is the land of Midian, the Midianites. Of course, the Midianites are important because of several different reasons. First of all, Moses, his father-in-law, is a Midianite. Jethro, the Midianite. He's the high priest of the true and living God among the Midianites. You say, well, how were the Midianites, how did they know who the true and living God was? Well, the Midianites are descendants of Abraham just like the Israelites are. So they had a heritage in their family of knowing who the true and living God was. Now, were all the Midianites worshiping the true and living God? No, definitely not. And the longer time went on, the fewer and fewer of the Midianites there were that were worshiping the true and living God, because we know by the time that the children of Israel get up into the promised land, during that period of the judges of several hundred years, the Midianites are a constant thorn in the flesh to the children of Israel living in the land of Canaan. And it is the Midianites, along with the Amalekites, that Gideon goes out and does battle with there in the middle of the night with only 300 men and the arm of the Lord on their side. God gives them a great victory. But the Midianites, they are descended of Abraham also. Now, I'll move the map again. Let's come back to Esau. Esau, after Jacob was sent away by his mother and father to some of their relatives over in Haran, Syria, he's left there at home. But he's not happy about what happened. He lost the birthright and the blessing to Jacob. And their mama's the one that deceived their father and caused him to lose the blessing. He's especially not happy. He's, I guess you could say, rebellious at this point. Look at Genesis 28, where we turned just a few minutes ago. Verses 8 and 9 tell us what Esau did after Jacob went to Uncle Laban's place over in Haran. Verse 8 says, "And Esau, seeing that the daughters of Canaan pleased not Isaac his father, then went Esau unto Ishmael, and took unto the wives which he had Mahalath, the daughter of Ishmael, Abraham's son, the sister of Nebajoth, to be his wife." And then Esau goes on to marry another girl among the Ishmaelites. So Esau ends up marrying one of these Ishmaelites. Now, they're not directly related, but they are cousins. They are related to each other. But Esau ends up intermarrying with these Ishmaelite girls. And of course, those are not the kind of people that his mom and daddy wanted him to marry. But at least they're not Canaanites. At least they're from the lineage of Abraham. So he marries these two girls. So we have the lineage of Esau and the lineage of Ishmael kind of, they come together at that point. It is the descendants of Esau and Ishmael that today produce many of those that we know as the Arabs living in that part of the world. And of course, the descendants of Keturah, they live, if we continued reading, in addition to Midian, they also include several names we would notice from the southern coast of Saudi Arabia. And so what we see here are that the descendants of Abraham through Keturah, through Ishmael, and through now his grandson Esau, they've intermarried with each other. So today's Saudi Arabia and this area around the land of Palestine today, all of these people that we generically refer to as Arabs are the intermingling of descendants of Abraham other than the Israelites. So what's so ironic, of course, is that all this turmoil in the Middle East today and for hundreds of years between the Israelites and the Arabs, well, they're actually cousins. They're related to each other. But of course, that doesn't keep there from being war and contention between them. All right, so I gave you all that background to say this. Esau is the founder of Edom. Esau is the father of Edom. Does anybody remember what Esau's name means?
Edom means red.
It means red. Esau's name and the name Edom both in different ways mean the color red. Esau came out hairy and red, our Bible tells us, and Esau ends up becoming the father of Edom. The Edomites are the descendants of Esau. One other thing that I'll say is that in Genesis chapter 36, it tells us who some of Esau's descendants are. If you don't want to turn there, you don't have to, but let me read just a couple of verses. In Genesis 36, beginning in verse 8, listen to what it says about Esau and Edom. Thus dwelt Esau in Mount Seir. Esau is Edom. And these are the generations of Esau, the father of the Edomites, in Mount Seir. These are the names of Esau's sons. Eliphaz, the son of Adah, the wife of Esau. Ruel, the son of Bashemath, the wife of Esau. And the sons of Eliphaz were Teman, Omar, Zepho, and Gatam, and Kenaz. And Timnah was concubine to Eliphaz, Esau's son, and she bare to Eliphaz Amalek. These were the sons of Adah, Esau's wife. So I'm not going to read the rest of the lineage of Esau, but I do want us to note that Esau is Edom. They are one and the same. His descendants are the Edomites. But one of his grandsons is Amalek, from whom the Amalekites come. And of course, the Amalekites are going to be another group of Israel's enemies during the Old Testament as well. So all of these enemies of Israel in this area, other than the Canaanites, are actually their relatives, their cousins. The Amalekites are shown here on the map, again, in this area between the land of Israel and the Sinai Peninsula. They live in this same general area where the Ishmaelites lived. So they're the grandchildren of Esau. So we've got the Edomites, the descendants of Esau, the Amalekites, who are the descendants of Esau. We've got the Ishmaelites here, and we've got some of the descendants of Keturah that live in the northern part of Arabia, all of them in this same general area, but they're all somewhat related to each other. Now, I went through all of that not because it has specifically to do with the things we're going to read in these 21 verses of Obadiah, but because I think a lot of times we don't know what the connections are between these different people, but knowing what the connections are really is what makes the entire Old Testament make sense to us when we're reading in different places, because if we know who these people are and how they're related to each other, it makes each book of the Old Testament make a lot more sense to us as we go through it. Now, we're through with the genealogy. I do want to give you just a little more history, though, before we dive in here to our study in Obadiah. During their time in Egypt, the children of Israel were there for about 400 years. I keep taking this map down. I should just leave it up for a minute. When they get ready to leave the land of Egypt, though, after about 400 years, they cross over through this area here. And as we've talked about in Sunday school class with the book of Exodus and other times, it is probably somewhere right in here where the children of Israel end up crossing the Red Sea. It's not over here where people oftentimes think that it is. It seems that it is more likely over here. They cross somewhere over this finger of the Red Sea, which is called the Gulf of Aqaba. And there's the land of Midian, where the Bible very clearly tells us they were in the book of Exodus after crossing the Red Sea. So it would not make sense for them to have crossed here. This is not the land of Midian. This is the land of Midian. But when they crossed over here and spent some time here at Mount Sinai, they then began to proceed towards the Promised Land. Because remember, they're going to get to the Promised Land, and God's going to give them the opportunity to go into the Promised Land. They're going to send out 12 spies into the land. Remember the song from Children's Church? 12 men went to spy on Canaan, 10 were bad and 2 were good. What do you think they saw in Canaan? 10 were bad and 2 were good. All right, I won't go with the rest of the song because y'all will leave because of my singing. But what their intention was to follow Moses up through here, hugging the western side of this mountain range. These are the Seir Mountains, S-E-I-R, for whom the place inhabited by the Edomites, the place that were the descendants of Esau. They were going to hug the western slopes of this because there was an ancient road that started in Egypt near Memphis, went across the desert to the Seir Mountains. It actually went down here to the Gulf of Aqaba and then up this western side of the mountain range. And then it went up the east side of the Jordan River up to Syria and then over to Mesopotamia. This was called the King's Highway. It was where kings, or rather their trade caravans, traveled back and forth from Egypt to Mesopotamia over here further to the east between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. They would travel this way and then this way and then up like that. So you could go from there, from Mesopotamia to Egypt, or from Egypt to Mesopotamia along this ancient road known as the King's Highway. The King's Highway went in large part through the land of the Edomites. From this point at the Gulf of Aqaba, all the way up, running beside the Seir mountain range inhabited by the Edomites, until they got to the Dead Sea, and then they went east up through the land of Moab and Ammon. But they would have to travel through the land of Edom. But when the children of Israel got to this place, and they were going to go through the land of the Edomites on their way to the Promised Land, Moses asked for permission from the Edomites for them to peacefully pass through the land. Now, they're related to the Edomites. They haven't really had any contact for some 400 years, but Moses assumed that the Edomites would at least let them pass through the land. Listen to what the request was and what the response was. I'm reading in Numbers 20, beginning in verse 14. It says, Moses sent messengers from Kadesh unto the king of Edom. Thus saith thy brother Israel, Thou knowest all the travail that hast befallen us, how our fathers went down into Egypt, and we have dwelt in Egypt a long time. And the Egyptians vexed us and our fathers. And when we cried unto the Lord, he heard our voice, and sent an angel, and hath brought us forth out of Egypt. And behold, we are in Kadesh, a city in the uttermost of thy border. Now, they were about that time right here in this area. They had come down here to the land of Midian, stayed here at Mount Sinai for a time. Then they had come back up through this way. You might say, why didn't they just go right on up here into the land of Canaan? Well, it's because the Philistines were in this area. And they couldn't pass through the Philistines because the Philistines, they thought, were too strong for them. So they're encamped at Kadesh. Moses sends word over to the Edomites and says, listen, can we just pass through your land? We just want to get on the King's Highway and go on up until we get to where we can cross the Jordan over into the land of Canaan. That's what he was asking permission to do. Let us pass, I pray thee, through thy country. We will not pass through the fields. In other words, we'll stay out of your cornfields. Or through the vineyards. Neither will we drink of the water of the wells. We will go by the King's highway. We will not turn to the right hand nor to the left until we have passed thy borders. And Edom said unto him, Thou shalt not pass by me, lest I come out against thee with the sword. Why, that's not the response that Moses was hoping for. And the children of Israel said unto him, We will go by the highway, and if I and my cattle drink of thy water, then I will pay for it. I will only, without doing anything else, go through on my feet. They said that second time, listen, we just want to go through the land. If we even drink your water, we'll pay you for it. And he said, Thou shalt not go through. And Edom came out against him with much people and with a strong hand. The Edomites came out with their swords strapped to their sides in large numbers and said, okay, come on if you want to, but we don't want you coming through our land. Thus Edom refused to give Israel passage through his border, wherefore Israel turned away from him. And the children of Israel, even the whole congregation, journeyed from Kadesh and came to Mount Hor. So they end up leaving here. This map has Mount Hor located here. It's believed it was probably further to the west. They came up here and they stayed a while, and then they eventually end up coming back down by the Gulf of Aqaba and going way, way around to the east, just so they didn't have to go through the land of the Edomites. The Edomites were cruel to their cousins, the Israelites. They were spiteful. They wouldn't let them pass. That was one of the things that the Edomites did to the children of Israel. But we also know in the Old Testament that the Edomites continually gave refuge to the Amalekites, the Midianites, and others who invaded the land of Israel during the period of the Judges, and were a constant thorn in the side of the children of Israel because they gave aid and comfort to their enemies. When David became king of Israel, he launched a series of invasions into Edom and subdued the Edomites, captured many of their cities, took possession of much of their land, even in the mountains. When David's son Solomon became king, he strengthened those outposts that the Israelites had, and he created a port city down here at the northern tip of the Gulf of Aqaba that became a major port city not only for the Israelites but for other people throughout the rest of the Old Testament period. And so Under the kings David and Solomon, the Edomites were subdued. The Israelites put their foot down and took possession, or at least control, of the land of the Edomites. But then you know what happened when Solomon died. The kingdom of Israel divided into the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. And the Edomites sprang back up, and they became a problem again, and they basically regained possession of their land. Well, that brings us to the book of Obadiah. I know I've spent a lot of time giving an introduction tonight, but we needed all of that to see who the Edomites were and why God has something against them. He actually has some other things as well. But look at Obadiah, verse 1. The vision of Obadiah, thus saith the Lord God. This word Lord is Adonai, so it's Adonai Jehovah, concerning Edom. We have heard a rumor from the Lord, and an ambassador is sent among the heathen. Arise ye, and let us rise up against her in battle. Behold, I have made thee small among the heathen. Thou art greatly despised. So the first thing God says to Edom, the land of Edom, the people of Edom, is that I've made you small among the heathen. So God calls them heathen, and he says, I've made you, not only are you a heathen, you're just a little bitty heathen. That kind of reminds me of some of the people in the neighborhood I grew up with as a boy. They were heathens, and there were a couple of them that were little heathens, but they were still heathens. Well, that's what God says about the Edomites. You're a heathen, but you're a little heathen. In other words, you're not much. That's what God's saying here. He says, thou art greatly despised. Verse 3, the pride of thine heart hath deceived thee. Now, I want to say that Edom, their entire history is a history of pride and arrogance, starting with Esau. Esau was in rebellion from the beginning. He despised his birthright. The Bible tells us that. And he was somewhat rebellious most of his life that we see in the Bible. Well, his descendants, it should be little surprise to us, they would turn out the same way. The Edomites are in rebellion to God, and they have the sin of pride. Well, why the sin of pride? All right, look at the rest of verse 3. Thou that dwellest in the clefts of the rock, whose habitation is high, that saith in his heart, who shall bring me down to the ground? Though thou shalt exalt thyself as the eagle, and though thou set thy nest among the stars, thence will I bring thee down, saith the Lord. Now, they were prideful because they thought they were untouchable. They lived in one of the most militarily secure places anybody could live. They lived in this mountain range that if you approached it from the west side, most of the places, it's nothing but steep cliffs. The mountain range averages 2,000 to 3,000 feet in height as you approach from the west. There are some places that are as high as 5,700 feet in altitude. Anybody know how many feet makes a mile?
5,200 feet.
5,280. So it's more than a mile high at the highest peak. So these people lived up like Boulder, Colorado, up there in the Rocky Mountains. They didn't think anybody could touch them. They had built their cities in the cliffs of the mountains there. Now, we have all seen those pictures of those beautifully carved front facades of buildings of the city of Petra in the red limestone cliffs, the fronts of those buildings that are carved. That is where the Edomites lived. I do have to tell you with a caveat, the Edomites are not the ones that carved those. Those were a later group of people that moved in after the Edomites. But that's the place where the Edomites lived. And just to get into those valleys where they built their cities up here in the mountains, the passageways to get into some of those valleys where they carved their cities in the cliffs would have been no wider than this middle aisle between the two rows of pews here at Pinnacle Baptist Church. So they could literally pack their soldiers right here in this little bitty narrow opening, shoulder to shoulder, and you could have an army of 1,000,000 men if you wanted to, but you can only bring 2 or at the most 3 men side by side through that passageway at the time. So it's no advantage to you to have 1,000,000 men if you can only get 2 or 3 up to the front line at a time to do the fighting. Because of that, it was a safe place defensively for those that lived there. The Edomites thought they were untouchable. The Edomites were a place that even though they were a small people, they thought they were safe. And because the King's Highway came through here, they were people that made their wealth off of charging those caravans passing back and forth, going different directions. They charged a toll to the caravans coming through one way or the other and made their money. And they got all kinds of beautiful, ornate, and expensive goods going from one place to the other on those caravans. They were a wealthy people to be so small, and they were a very safe people, or so they thought. Look at verse number 5. God continues, "If thieves came to thee, if robbers by night, how art thou cut off? Would they not have stolen till they had enough? If the grape gatherers came to thee, would they not leave some grapes?" What God says here is, listen, even a thief or a robber, if he goes into somebody's house and breaks in, he might grab up whatever it is he wants to carry off, but he's not going to carry off everything. He's going to carry off what he can, but he's going to leave something behind. Those that gather the grapes, God said, listen, they might come to gather the grapes, but they're not going to get all the grapes. They're going to miss some of them here and there. I know when I was a little boy growing up, we'd go out to pick blackberries. Always got covered in chiggers while we were doing that, but we loved eating the blackberries afterwards. But we would go out there we would go out in the morning to pick them. We'd go out there in the afternoon and see blackberries we had missed somehow. But God says the same thing about these grape gatherers. He said, listen, even a grape gatherer, that's a mouthful, is going to miss some. How are the things of Esau searched out? How are his hidden things sought up? All the men of thy confederacy have brought thee even to the border. The men that were at peace with thee hath deceived thee, and prevailed against thee. They that eat thy bread have laid a wound under thee. There is none understanding in him. God said, listen, you take every single thing you can get from those that you take advantage of. And because of that, even those you're in alliance with are going to deceive you. Now, the Edomites didn't mind making raids over into the land of Judah, here in the southern part of Israel, not because they were strong enough militarily to overcome the Jews that lived there, but because they, number one, knew they could retreat back to their mountain fortresses. But number two, the Edomites had become very good at diplomacy. That is, they realized they were small, heathen, and so they had made pacts, alliances, confederations with the Egyptians at times, with the Babylonians at times, and with others at times. And so they felt like they were safe because if anybody messed with them, they would have to deal with either the Egyptians or the Babylonians, the two big boys on the block. Again, kind of reminds me of some of those little heathens I grew up with down the road. But God said to the Edomites, those that you're in alliance with are going to betray you. He says, they have deceived thee and prevailed against thee. They that eat thy bread have laid a wound under thee. He says, those that you're trusting to protect you are going to be your downfall. They are going to abandon you. Verse 8, shall I not in that day, saith the Lord, even destroy the wise men out of Edom, and understanding out of the mount of Esau? Those of you who think you're so smart, don't you think that I'm going to destroy you? Verse 9, thy mighty men, O Teman. Now Teman was one of the sons of Esau, and there's a city named after him in the land of Edom. Thy mighty men, O Teman, shall be dismayed. So both the wise and the mighty are going to be dismayed by God. To the end that every one of the mount of Esau may be cut off by slaughter. For thy violence against thy brother Jacob, shame shall cover thee, and thou shalt be cut off forever. Now, again, God's already changed Jacob's name to Israel. Jacob is long since buried, but God uses not the name Israel, but the name Jacob. I think God uses the name Jacob here in speaking to the Edomites because he's saying, okay, Esau, your brother Jacob that you've committed violence against, that violence is going to be brought back against you. Edom is Esau. Esau is Edom. In the day that thou stoodest on the other side, in the day that the strangers carried away captive his forces, and foreigners entered into his gates, and cast lots upon Jerusalem, even thou wast as one of them. Now here, verse 11 is one of the clues that might tell us an approximate time frame when this prophecy was written to Edom. It seems that verse 11 is talking about the date of 586 BC. Does anyone remember what important thing happened in Israel, specifically in Jerusalem, in 586 BC? Brother Mike is right. That's when Nebuchadnezzar conquered the city of Jerusalem, took Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, a whole bunch of others, captive back to the land of Babylon, scattered them throughout his kingdom, and took all the things out of the temple of God, had the temple destroyed, the walls of the city destroyed, and left the city of Jerusalem in ruins. Well, we know historically that at that time, the Edomites were in alliance with the Babylonians. So the Edomites allowed the Babylonians passage through their land to attack the southern kingdom of Judah. And when the Babylonians went in and sacked the city of Jerusalem, apparently the Edomites took advantage of that, and they swarmed into the land also to get what they could get that was left over by the Babylonians. But God says here that you were there when the foreigners entered into his gates, that is, into the gates of Jerusalem, and cast lots upon Jerusalem. Even thou wast as one of them. You were one of the ones responsible for that, God says. Verse 12. But thou shouldest not have looked on the day of thy brother in the day that he became a stranger. God says you treated your brethren, the Israelites, as a stranger. Neither shouldest thou have rejoiced over the children of Judah in the day of their destruction. Neither shouldest thou have spoken proudly in the day of distress. Thou shouldest not have entered into the gate of my people in the day of their calamity. Yea, thou shouldest not have looked on their affliction in the day of their calamity, nor have laid hands on their substance in the day of their calamity. God says, you took advantage of them when they had been destroyed by the Babylonians. Neither shouldest thou have stood in the crossway to cut off those of his that did escape. Neither shouldest thou have delivered up those of his that did remain in the day of distress. God said, you not only let the enemy just go right on through and attack your brother, you then went in, took his stuff when he couldn't defend himself, and when some of his people tried to flee and escape, you killed some of them with the sword, and some of them you took prisoner and turned them over to his enemies. Now that's a pretty despicable thing to do. God's saying you're going to be judged because of it. Now look what their punishment will be. Verse 15. For the day of the Lord is near upon all the heathen. Here's that term, the day of the Lord again. It always means judgment for those that are guilty, followed by God's blessings on his people. For the day of the Lord is near upon all the heathen. As thou hast done, it shall be done unto thee. Thy reward shall return upon thine own head. For as ye have drunk upon my holy mountain, so shall all the heathen drink continually. Yea, they shall drink, and they shall swallow down, and they shall be as though they had not been. God says, I'm going to allow your enemies to do the same to you that you've done to your brother Jacob. Verse 17. But upon Mount Zion shall be deliverance. I'm going to destroy you, but I'm going to deliver Zion, Jacob. And there shall be holiness, and the house of Jacob shall possess their possessions. And the house of Jacob shall be a fire, and the house of Joseph a flame, and the house of Esau for stubble. And they shall kindle in them and devour them. And there shall not be any remaining of the house of Esau, for the Lord hath spoken it. God said, even though all this calamity has come upon Jacob, Israel, in the end, I'm going to deliver them. You've enjoyed prosperity, but in the end, I'm going to destroy you. I'll deliver them and destroy you. And they of the south shall possess the mount of Esau, and they of the plain of the Philistines. And they shall possess the fields of Ephraim, and the fields of Samaria, and Benjamin shall possess Gilead. And the captivity of this host of the children of Israel shall possess that of the Canaanites, even unto Zarephath. And the captivity of Jerusalem, which is in Sepharad, shall possess the cities of the south. And Savior shall come up on Mount Zion to judge the mount of Esau, and the kingdom shall be the Lord's. Now the end of this chapter is a prophetic passage that some would say has already been fulfilled with the destruction of Edom as a kingdom. But I submit to you, it seems from the things that are said about what God will do for Jacob in the passage, that it seems to be talking about the still far distant millennial reign of Christ, when God is going to give Israel all of this land that was promised to him. Much of it that was under the control of Israel during the reign of David and Solomon, but they've never had all of the land that was promised to them in the Abrahamic covenant. But it seems to be talking about a future time when Israel will again be at peace, they'll again be prosperous, and they will retake this land, including the land of Edom, for their own. Since the Babylonians conquered Judah in 586 BC, there has never been a time since then when the people of Israel regained all of this land that is described in these few verses. The land that is being described in these verses includes not only the land of Edom to the south, it says that Benjamin, down here in the southern kingdom of Judah, will also inherit all this land in Gilead. Israel has not again possessed all of this land on the east and west side of the Jordan since 586 BC. So it seems that this passage at the end of the book is God's promise that in the end times, He's going to restore all this land to Israel. That's for the millennial reign of Christ that even in our day is still yet in the future. Now, I want to do one last thing before I finish, because I need to wrap up the history of the Edomites. After the Babylonians conquered Israel, conquered Judah, the Babylonians then did exactly what the book of Obadiah says. They turned on the Edomites and they captured, took whatever they wanted from the Edomites. And the Edomites were in such shambles after that people from northern Arabia came up into the land of Edom and literally ran the Edomites out of the land of Edom. The Edomites were run out of their own land because the Babylonians, their allies, deceived them, tricked them, and took much of what they had. Well, the Edomites then moved west into the southern area where the Jews had lived. Remember, most of the Jews, or at least many of the Jews, had been taken out of the land by the Babylonians and spread throughout the Babylonian Empire, which later became the Persian Empire. After 70 years under those that we read in the Old Testament, Ezra and Nehemiah, some of the Jews returned back to the land, to the city of Jerusalem. And they rebuilt the city. They rebuilt the temple. They even rebuilt the walls. But the Edomites, by that time, were already permanently living in this area where the Jews were now returned to. This period between the end of the last few books of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New Testament, that 400 years there, is a period of history that we know about what happened historically, but it's not recorded in the Bible. The Edomites were just kind of living alongside the Jews who had returned to the land. Over those several hundred years, there was some intermarrying to some degree. This is the period when the Greeks, under Alexander the Great, conquered this area. Then Alexander the Great died. His kingdom was divided into 4 parts among his 4 generals. The Seleucid Empire, one of his generals, captured this area of the Levant, the land of Israel. And while these Greeks were in control of the land of Israel, the Jews revolted against them. Now, we don't have the Apocrypha in our Bible, but those are books between the Old Testament and New Testament. They're not Scripture, but there are some historical things in there, some that are true, some that probably are not true. But one of the things that is true is that there were a series of revolts called the Maccabean revolts. The Maccabean revolts were Jewish patriots who were trying to run the Greeks out of their land and regain control of their own land again. Well, they ended up being successful, and they established for a period of time a Jewish kingdom of sorts in the land here. And the Jews forced the Edomites living in this land here with them to convert or die or leave. That was the ultimatum that it is said that they gave to the Edomites living in the land. So during this several hundred years, just before the New Testament starts, the Edomites that are living here, no longer in their own homeland, they converted to Judaism so that they could continue to live where they had been living for several hundred years already. As a result, this land, when the Romans took it over from the Greeks, the Romans came in and did what the Romans always did when they went into a new place and conquered it. They went in and they tried to find who were some of the wealthiest families and rulers in the land to make deals with them that if they would support Rome, they could keep what they had. And Rome would let them continue to be the local rulers of the area. Well, at this point, some of the wealthiest families in this land of Judea were former Edomites. One particular family known as the Herods, Herods. The Herod family were allowed by the Romans to be the governors, the kings of this area, as long as they kept everybody in line and paid homage to Rome. This is the same Herod family that we meet when we start the New Testament. Herod the Great had things built onto the temple in Jerusalem to show favor to the Jews and try to win their support. Of course, there was also Herod who, when Jesus was born, he did the same thing Pharaoh had done hundreds of years before and ordered all the male Hebrew children to be killed, trying to get rid of the king of the Jews who had been born, the Messiah. Those Edomites, when they had left Edom and fled west over into the land that belonged to the Jews, they became known. They ceased to be called Edomites, and they began to be called by a name very close to that, the Idumeans. It's from the same root word as Edom. It still means red in whatever language you translate it. The Idumeans, the Romans called the land Palestine because it had previously been the home of the Philistines. But the Idumeans were the people that lived there. They were Edomites who had converted to Judaism, but they weren't true Jews. They were Edomites. God had said way back in the beginning of the Old Testament that Edom was forever the enemy of his brother Jacob. Well, now when Jesus was born, Edomites are ruling in Judea, the home of the Jews. But the Idumeans, by this point, had adopted the Jewish culture, the Jewish religion, the Jewish way of life, and they lived right alongside the Jews. It was in their best interest to look after the interest of the Jews, because they were the rulers of the Jews now. As you know, after Jesus' crucifixion, the Jews ended up revolting against Rome. The Romans came in with, I think at one time they had over 500,000 Roman soldiers in the land, almost 500,000 soldiers, to subdue the Jewish revolt. When the Romans put down the revolts finally, they had killed between 1 and 2 million Jews. They had taken 500,000 Jews as slaves and sold them throughout the Roman Empire. They destroyed the temple in Jerusalem, and the rest of the Jews were scattered throughout the Roman Empire. The Idumeans, who claimed to be Jews at that point, they were scattered with those who were real Jews all throughout the Roman Empire. And for the next 2,000 some odd years, they've been living around the world in amongst the Jews, calling themselves Jews. To this day, most Jews do not know if they are actually from the lineage of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, or if they are Edomians who converted to Judaism. Now, we don't have time to go into it, and the truth is there's not enough historical proof either way, but there are those who believe that the Rothschilds and some of those Jews who are against God are actually not Jews at all, but are Edomians who are counterfeit Jews today. I don't know how much of that's true, how much of it's not, but we do know that the Edomites mixed with the Jews and were spread throughout the world with the Jews, and they continued to call themselves Jews. There is no doubt that some of those who are behind the Zionist movement of the 20th century may in fact not have been Jews at all, and perhaps that's why they were the useful tools of Satan in the Zionist movement, and perhaps they are still the avowed enemies of Israel, of Jacob to this day, because they're actually the descendants of Edom. But we do know there's a day coming when God is going to destroy every descendant of Edom, because that's what Obadiah prophesied in the end. The last verse said, "And Savior shall come up on Mount Zion to judge the mount of Esau, and the kingdom shall be the Lord's." The day is coming during the millennial reign of Christ when all of the land will belong to Israel, including Edom, and the Edomites that are alive will be destroyed once and for all. Well, that brings us to the end of Obadiah. I went significantly over tonight, but it's only one chapter. I didn't want to cut it into two. Does anyone have any questions or any comments before we stop for tonight?